The Soviet Union enforced the collectivization of its agricultural sector between 1928 and 1940 during the ascendancy of Joseph Stalin. The policy aimed to consolidate individual landholdings and labor into collective farms, mainly kolkhozy and sovkhozy. The Soviet leadership confidently expected that the replacement of individual peasant farms by collective ones would immediately increase the food supply for the urban population, the supply of raw materials for processing industry, and agricultural exports. Planners regarded collectivization as the solution to the crisis of agricultural distribution that had developed from 1927. This problem became more acute as the Soviet Union pressed ahead with its ambitious industrialization program. In the early 1930s, over 91% of agricultural land became collectivized, as rural households entered collective farms with their land, livestock, and other assets. The sweeping collectivization often involved tremendous human and social costs. Background: after the emancipation of the serfs in 1861, peasants gained control of about half of the land they had previously cultivated, and began to ask for the redistribution of all land. The Stolypine agricultural reforms between 1905 and 1914 gave incentives for the creation of large farms, but these ended during World War I. The Russian provisional government accomplished little during the difficult World War I months. Though Russian leaders continued to promise redistribution, peasants began to turn against the provisional government and organize themselves into land committees, which together with the traditional peasant communes became a powerful force of opposition. When Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia on April 16, 1917, he promised the people peace, land and bread, the latter two appearing as a promise to the peasants for the redistribution of confiscated land and a fair share of food for every worker respectively. During the period of war communism, however, the policy of Prodrazvyustka meant that the peasantry was obligated to surrender the surpluses of almost any kind of agricultural produce for a fixed price. When the Russian Civil War ended, the economy changed with the new economic policy and specifically the policy of prodnalog or food tax. This new policy was designed to rebuild morale among embittered farmers and lead to increased production. The pre-existing communes, which periodically redistributed land, did little to encourage improvement in technique, and formed a source of power beyond the control of the Soviet government. Although the income gap between wealthy and poor farmers did grow under the NEP, it remained quite small. But the Bolsheviks began to take aim at the wealthy kulaks. Clearly identifying this group was difficult, though, since only about 1% of the peasantry employed laborers, and 82% of the country's population were peasants. The small shares of most of the peasants resulted in food shortages in the cities. Although grain had nearly returned to pre-war production levels, the large estates which had produced it for urban markets had been divided up. Not interested in acquiring money to purchase overpriced manufactured goods, the peasants chose to consume their produce rather than sell it. As a result, city dwellers only saw half the grain that had been available before the war. Before the revolution, peasants controlled only 2,100,000 square kilometers divided into 16 million holdings, producing 50% of the food grown in Russia and consuming 60% of total food production. After the revolution, the peasants controlled 3,140,000 square kilometers divided into 25 million holdings, producing 85% of the food, but consuming 80% of what they grew. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union had never been happy with private agriculture and saw collectivization as the best remedy for the problem. Lenin claimed, small-scale production gives birth to capitalism and the bourgeoisie constantly, daily, hourly, with elemental force, and in vast proportions, apart from ideological goals. Joseph Stalin also wished to embark on a program of rapid heavy industrialization which required larger surpluses to be extracted from the agricultural sector in order to feed a growing industrial workforce and to pay for imports of machinery. Social and ideological goals would also be served through mobilization of the peasants in a cooperative economic enterprise which would produce higher returns for the state and could serve a secondary purpose of providing social services to the people. Crisis of 1928. This demand for more grain resulted in the reintroduction of requisitioning, which was resisted in rural areas. In 1928 there was a 2 million ton shortfall in grains purchased by the Soviet Union from neighboring markets. Stalin claimed the grain had been produced but was being hoarded by kulaks. Instead of raising the price, the Politburo adopted an emergency measure to requisition 2.5 million tons of grain. The seizures of grain discouraged the peasants and less grain was produced during 1928, and again the government resorted to requisitions. Much of the grain being requisitioned from middle peasants as sufficient quantities were not in the hands of the kulaks. In 1929, especially after the introduction of the Ural-Siberian method of grain procurement, resistance to grain seizures became widespread with some violent incidents of resistance. Also, massive hoarding and illegal transfers of grain took place. Faced with the refusal to hand grain over, a decision was made at a plenary session of the Central Committee in November 1929 to embark on a nationwide program of collectivization. Several forms of collective farming were suggested by the People's Commissariat for Agriculture, distinguished according to the extent to which property was held in common. Association for joint cultivation of land, where only land was in common use. Agricultural artel, agricultural commune, with the highest level of common use of resources. Also, various cooperatives for processing of agricultural products were installed. In November 1929, the Central Committee decided to implement accelerated collectivization in the form of kolkhozes and sovkhozes. This marked the end of the new economic policy, which had allowed peasants to sell their surpluses on the open market. Stalin had many so-called kulaks transported to collective farms in distant places to work in agricultural labor camps. It has been calculated that 1 in 5 of these deportees, many of them women and children, died. In response to this, many peasants began to resist, often arming themselves against the activists sent from the towns. As a form of protest, many peasants preferred to slaughter their animals for food rather than give them over to collective farms, which produced a major reduction in livestock. Collectivization had been encouraged since the revolution, but in 1928, only about 1% of farmland was collectivized. And despite efforts to encourage and coerce collectivization, the rather optimistic first 5-year plan only forecast 15% of farms to be run collectively. All-out drive, winter 1929-30. The situation changed incredibly quickly in the fall of 1929 and winter of 1930. Between September and December 1929, collectivization increased from 7.4% to 15%, but in the first 2 months of 1930, 11 million households joined collectivized farms, pushing the total to nearly 60% almost overnight. To assist collectivization, the party decided to send 25,000 socially conscious industry workers to the countryside. This was accomplished during 1929 to 1933, and these workers have become known as 25,000ers. Shock brigades were used to force reluctant peasants into joining the collective farms and remove those who were declared kulaks and their agents. Collectivization sought to modernize Soviet agriculture, consolidating the land into parcels that could be farmed by modern equipment using the latest scientific methods of agriculture. It was often claimed that an American Fordson tractor was the best propaganda in favor of collectivization. The Communist Party, which adopted the plan in 1929, predicted an increase of 330% in industrial production, and an increase of 50% in agricultural production. The means of production were to be totally socialized, i.e., removed from the control of individual peasant households. Not even any private household garden plots were allowed for. Agricultural work was envisioned on a mass scale. Huge glamorous columns of machines were to work the fields, in total contrast to peasants' small-scale work. The peasants traditionally mostly held their land in the form of large numbers of strips scattered throughout the fields of the village community. By an order of 7 January 1930, all boundary lines separating the land allotments of the members of the artel are to be eliminated and all fields are to be combined in a single land mass. The basic rule governing the rearrangement of the fields was that the process would have to be completed before the spring planting. The new kolkhozy were initially envisioned as giant organizations unrelated to the preceding village communities. Kolkhozy of tens, or even hundreds, of thousands of hectares were envisioned in schemes which were later to become known as gigantomania. They were planned to be divided into economies of 5,000, 10,000 hectares, which were in turn divided into fields and sections without regard to the existing villages. The aim was to achieve a fully depersonalized optimum land area. Parallel with this were plans to transfer the peasants to centralized agro-towns offering modern amenities. In the prevailing socio-economic conditions, little could become of such utopian schemes. The giant kolkhozy were always exceptional, existing mainly on paper, and in any case they were mostly soon to disappear. The peasants chose to remain in their traditional, primitive villages. Dizzy with success, the price of collectivization was so high that the March 2, 1930 issue of Pravda contained Stalin's article Dizzy with Success, in which he called for a temporary halt to the process. It is a fact that by February 20 of this year, 50% of the peasant farms throughout the USSR had been collectivized. That means that by February 20, 1930, we had overfulfilled the 5-year plan of collectivization by more than 100%. Some of our comrades have become dizzy with success and for the moment have lost clearness of mind and sobriety of vision. After the publication of the article, the pressure for collectivization temporarily abated and peasants started leaving collective farms. According to Martin Kitchen, the number of members of collective farms dropped by 50% in 1930. But soon collectivization was intensified again, and by 1936, about 90% of Soviet agriculture was collectivized. Peasant resistance. Theoretically, landless peasants were to be the biggest beneficiaries from collectivization, because it promised them an opportunity to take an equal share in labor and its rewards. In fact, however, rural areas did not have many landless peasants, given the wholesale redistribution of land following the revolution. Alternatively, for those with property, collectivization meant forfeiting land up to the collective farms and selling most of the harvest to the state at minimal prices set by the state itself. This, in turn, engendered opposition to the idea. Furthermore, collectivization involved significant changes in the traditional village life of Russian peasants within a very short time frame. Despite the long Russian rural tradition of collectivism in the village Obshchina or Mir, the changes were even more dramatic in other places, such as in Ukraine, with its tradition of individual farming, in the Soviet republics of Central Asia, and in the Trans-Volga steppes, where for a family to have a herd of livestock was not only a matter of sustenance, but of pride as well. Peasants viewed collectivization as the end of the world. By no means was joining the collective farm voluntary. The drive to collectivize came without peasant support. The intent was to increase state grain procurements without giving the peasants the opportunity to withhold grain from the market. Collectivization would increase the total crop and food supply, but the locals knew that they were not likely to benefit from it. Peasants tried to protest through peaceful means by speaking out at collectivization meetings and writing letters to the central authorities. When their strategies failed, villagers turned to violence, committing arson, and lynching and murdering local authorities, kolkhozy leaders, and activists. Others responded with acts of sabotage, including the burning of crops and the slaughter of draft animals. According to party sources, there were also some cases of destruction of property, and attacks on officials and members of the collectives. Isaac Mazepa, Prime Minister of the Ukrainian National Republic in 1919–1920, claimed the catastrophe of 1932 was the result of passive resistance, which aimed at the systematic frustration of the Bolsheviks' plans for the sowing and gathering of the harvest. In his words, whole tracts were left unsown, and as much as 50% of the crop was left in the fields, and was either not collected at all or was ruined in the threshing. Fueled by fear and anxiety, rumors spread throughout the villages leading to these acts. Rumors associated the Soviet government with the Antichrist, threatened an end to traditional ways of peasant life, and worked to unite the peasants to protest against collectivization. Collectivization as a second serfdom. Rumors circulated in the villages warning the rural residents that collectivization would bring disorder, hunger, famine, and the destruction of crops and livestock. Readings and reinterpretations of Soviet newspapers labeled collectivization as a second serfdom. Villagers were afraid the old landowners, serf owners, were coming back, and that the villagers joining the collective farm would face starvation and famine. More reason for peasants to believe collectivization was a second serfdom was that entry into the kolkhoz had been forced. Farmers did not have the right to leave the collective without permission. The level of state procurements and prices on crops also enforced the serfdom analogy. The government would take a majority of the crops and pay extremely low prices. The serfs during the 1860s were paid nothing, but collectivization still reminded the peasants of serfdom. To them, this second serfdom became code for the communist betrayal of the revolution. To the peasants, the revolution was about giving more freedom and land to the peasants, but instead they had to give up their land and livestock to the collective farm. Women's role in resistance. Women were the primary vehicle for rumors that touched upon issues of family and everyday life. Fears that collectivization would result in the socialization of children, the export of women's hair, communal wife sharing, and the notorious common blanket affected many women, causing them to revolt. For example, when it was announced that a collective farm in Crimea would become a commune and that the children would be socialized, women killed their soon-to-be socialized livestock, which spared the children. Stories that the communists believed short hair gave women a more urban and industrial look insulted peasant women. After local activists in a village in North Caucasus actually confiscated all blankets, more fear dispersed among villages. The common blanket meant that all men and women would sleep on a 700-meter-long bed under a 700-meter-long blanket. Historians argue that women took advantage of these rumors without actually believing them, so they could attack the collective farm under the guise of a rational, non-political protest. Women were less vulnerable to retaliation than peasant men, and therefore able to get away with a lot more. Peasant women were rarely held accountable for their actions because of the officials' perceptions of their protests. They physically blocked the entrances to huts of peasants, scheduled to be exiled as kulaks, forcibly took back socialized seed and livestock, and led assaults on officials. Officials ran away and hid to let the riots run their course. When women came to trial, they were given less harsh punishments as the men because women, to officials, were seen as illiterate and the most backward part of the peasantry. One particular case of this was a riot in a Russian village of Belovka where protesters were beating members of the local Soviet and setting fire to their homes. The men were held exclusively responsible as the main culprits. Women were given sentences to serve as a warning, not as a punishment. Because of how they were perceived, women were able to play an essential role in the resistance to collectivization. Religious persecution. Collectivization did not just entail the acquisition of land from farmers but also the closing of churches, burning of icons, and the arrests of priests. Associating the church with the Tsarist regime, the Soviet state continued to undermine the church through expropriations and repression. They cut off state financial support to the church and secularized church schools. Peasants began to associate communists with atheists because the attack on the church was so devastating. The communist assault on religion and the church angered many peasants, giving them more reason to revolt. Riots exploded after the closing of churches as early as 1929. Identification of Soviet power with the Antichrist also decreased peasants' support for the Soviet regime. Rumors about religious persecution spread mostly by word of mouth, but also through leaflets and proclamations. Priests preached that the Antichrist had come to place the devil's mark on the peasants, and that Soviet state was promising the peasants a better life but was actually signing them up for hell. Peasants feared that if they joined the collective farm they would be marked with the stamp of the Antichrist. They faced a choice between God and the Soviet collective farm. Choosing between salvation and damnation, peasants had no choice but to resist policies of the state. These rumors of the Soviet state as the Antichrist functioned to keep peasants from succumbing to the government. The attacks on religion and the church affected women the most because they were upholders of religion within the villages.